It's great to be back. We had a great time in India and Malaysia and Singapore. We've seen and eaten lots of roosters. Happy Lunar New Year to all those who are celebrating. I trust you had a great time with family and friends. I was reading a report of about Chinese 20-something young men who are heading back for Chinese New Year to their families. And they were so worried about the pressure to get a girlfriend that and the kind of flack they were going to cop when they went home, that they were taking advantage of an app. It's called Please Hire Me. And 700,000 people have signed up for this, so they can go home and a pretend girlfriend will turn up so that their family won't hassle them about why they're not married. So there's a bit of a connection between Lunar New Year and what we're talking about today. This series is about what would you ask God? Apologetic series on common questions that people ask in relation to Christianity. This question about marriage may be the question that you have yourself, or maybe something that you've been asked about. If you've been engaging with people around you in our modern culture, and they know that you're a Christian, you've been asked this question for sure. What's the big deal about marriage? Why are Christians so uptight about marriage? Surely if people love each other, why can't they just do whatever they want? What business is it of yours or God's or anybody else's what happens in my bedroom and my love life? Surely if people love each other, they ought to be able to get married regardless of gender, beliefs, etc., etc. And Bible-believing Christians are being asked more questions about this, and people are questioning why are Christians so uptight about this question of marriage? Of course, it's come into prominence because of the push to change the definition of marriage in our law system. Now, it's important how we handle these things because God tells us always to be ready to give an answer, an apology, if you like, apologia, for the hope that's within us. In 1 Peter 3 verse 15, in your hearts honour Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defence to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. With this issue, that is quite difficult, to gently respect somebody and yet to clearly put in front of them what marriage is all about. So the foundational question that underlies these questions that I've raised here is, what is marriage? What's it about? What's its purpose? Why was it started? And why has it remained basically unchanged through every society for millennia? Now, it's very important for us to understand what God says on this subject, and the way marriage is presented right at the beginning of the Bible. It's part of the creation story. Long before we talked about religion and Christianity and stuff like that, way back in the beginning, God made it quite clear what marriage is all about. So it comes up very early in the Bible, Genesis 1 and 2. They've just been read to us. And this is the go-to passage for the gospel writers, for Jesus himself, and for Paul. When they talk about marriage, they go back to this foundational passage and quote it. 4 times it's quoted in the New Testament and, of course, alluded to many more times. Now, when we talk about these things, it often raises issues for people. Guilt, feelings of loneliness or being let down by God and others, unwanted sexual attractions, pornography, past failures, all these kinds of pastoral things come up for us. And if we learn one thing from this passage today, it is the fact that God says it's not good for us to be alone, that we need one another. And that if you're struggling in this area And I know for sure that 100% of us are. That's my own personal experience and pastoral experience, that we struggle with living God's way in this area. God says it's not good for you to do that alone. Reach out to one of the pastoral team or reach out to a mature Christian friend and enlist their help if you're struggling with these kinds of issues. And if somebody does that to you, if somebody reaches out to you, please help them. Please support them. Please encourage them in their struggle to live a godly life. That's why God's put us in families. That's why He's put us in His family, in the Christian family, so we can help each other to live God's way. First point on your outline, which is on the back of the news sheet, by the way, about marriage. What's such a big deal about marriage is that God made it for our good. God made it for our good. Again, marriage is first mentioned in Genesis chapter 1. God created male and female in His image. So we learn from this that sexuality is a God-given thing. It's part of God's gift of our human nature. Contrary to other religions at the time, sexuality is not in the gods. So if you look at the Hindu pantheon of gods, you have male and female gods, and in other systems that were around at the time. In the Bible, sexuality is something that was created by God for humans. It's not something that arose out of the maleness and femaleness of gods. It was something created by God for us. So humanity is male and female, both equally in the image of God. Now today, another big frontier in the cultural wars that is opening up is that people want to deny the reality of that, of their genetics, and say, well, I don't want to be male, I want to be a female, I want to be something in between, or I want to switch and change, I want to make this fluid, and deny the reality of our God-given gender and the reality of genetics. What does it mean to be made in God's image? Some people have tried to define this in terms of what we can do. The abilities and capacities that we have that no other creature has, creativity, the ability to reason that distinguishes us from other creatures. Well, the context here really focuses on relationship. Even in the way that God states this, He says, let us make man in our image. It's in the plural. And of course that indicates that within the Godhead itself, the Trinity, is relational. So God the Father loves the Son. He sends the Son. He empowers the Son. The Son loves the Father. The Son does the will of the Father. The Father and the Son send the Spirit. The Spirit glorifies Jesus. The Spirit does the work of the Father. You see how that works? It's all interrelated, interrelational. And it's all other-centred. You see how that works? The Father sends the Son, glorifies the Son glorifies the Father, does the will, and so on. They are other-centred. And to be made in the image of God means that we work best when we are other-centred. And the flip side of that is we work worst when we are self-centred. We were not made to be the centre of the universe, no matter how much you believe that you are. That is not the design specification for human beings. We were designed to be other-centred, and of course, this has huge implications for marriage, doesn't it? We've been married for 38 years now. We know that our relationship works worst when we're focused on what we want. Inevitably brings fights and clashes. And we work best when we're focused on meeting the needs of the other. That is the way God designed us. That is the way, by the way, that our relationship with God works as well. The more I think that being a Christian is about me getting what I want, being healthy, wealthy, prosperous, wise, all that stuff, the worse it works. And the more I focus on exalting Jesus as my Lord, the better it works. The more I understand about Him and the more I understand about myself. So God created us, male and female, in his image. Secondly, good, very good, not good, in Genesis 2:18 to 23. And God had been at work for almost 6 days when he created us. At the end of every day, he stands back and he says, he looks at all that he made and he said, it's good. At the end of the 6th day, when he created human beings, he said, it's very good. That's the grand finale of chapter 1. God stands back from all that he's made and he says, it's very good. But then in chapter 2, which of course in chapter 2 you go through the creation again from another angle. In chapter 2, after God had created everything, and before he created Adam and Eve, he says it's not good for the man to be alone. Sorry, after he had created Adam. There's something that isn't good, and that is for the man to be alone. That's the only thing in the creation that's not good. That's in verse 18 of chapter 2. Mother Teresa said this, loneliness and the feeling of being uncared for and unwanted are the greatest poverty. Loneliness and the feeling of being uncared for and unwanted are the greatest poverty. God doesn't want us to be like that. He created us for relationship with him, with our families, and with our church family. Now, we do well to recognise this basic need. We cannot go it alone. We do well to recognise this basic need in each other. I think actually we ought to assume that each other are feeling lonely and uncared for. That'd be a much better place to start from than thinking everyone's okay, I don't need to worry about them. Wouldn't it be better to start from God's starting point, saying, well, it's not good for people to be alone and to feel uncared for. So God makes woman. And incidentally, this is the only account of the creation of woman that we find in ancient literature. In verse 21. Verses 18 and 20, we find the words, a suitable helper. Suitable helper for Adam was not found amongst the animals. No matter how much you like that feel-good story in the news every end of every week about some lost gorilla or some cat that got caught up a tree, or how much you love your pet, you were not ultimately made for a relationship with a pet. We were made for a relationship with one another. And so a suitable helper is made for Adam. There are 2 Hebrew words here. One simply means helper. Now, some people find this term demeaning, but it isn't that. Adam needed help. There were areas for which he was inadequate. Looking after the creation, he needed help with that. Being fruitful and multiplying. How much help did he need with that? And that was God's command. He could not do that on his own. This is not a demeaning word. It doesn't imply a secondary function. In fact, the word is often applied to God himself in the rest of the Old Testament. God is frequently said to be the helper of human beings. The second word is one that means opposite or corresponding to or counterpart or complement or match. That's the second meaning of the second Hebrew word. Somebody different to him who would complement him, who would be the missing half of the puzzle, that together they would bear the image of God and reflect him. We're different, aren't we? And there's nothing wrong with that. Male and female need each other. And it's good that we complement each other, isn't it? I know how wonderfully that works in our relationship. We are very different people, and we have taught each other so much and helped each other so much to become more whole people. And let me encourage you, if you're looking for a marriage partner, if you're single, don't look for someone who's exactly like you. I think that'll be very difficult. If I married someone like me, I think, yeah, no, let's not go there. God made us to complement one another and to enrich one another. So Adam recognised Eve as such. Matthew Henry writes this, and you've probably heard this before. Eve was made by God not out of his head to rule over him, nor out of his feet to be trampled upon by him, but out of his side to be equal with him, and under his arm to be protected, and near his heart to be loved. Now notice in verse 22 that this whole thing was God's idea. Okay, so he brought the woman to the man like a heavenly father bringing a bride, and presents her to him. And as soon as Adam saw Eve, he knew that this was who he'd been looking for. In verse 23, he says these words, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." You can sense the excitement there. At last. And it's significant, I think, isn't it, that the first recorded words of a human being in the Bible are a love song, a response of Adam to Eve. So all is good in the garden again. That feeling of not goodness about Adam being alone has been fixed. In verse 24, God talks about marriage being about a man and a woman leaving, cleaving, and becoming one. Now notice the sequence here: leave, cleave, become one flesh. And we turn that around to our peril. If we become one flesh and then decide down the track whether or not we're going to leave or cleave, that generally ends in disaster. Leave, cleave, become one flesh. Leave your mother and father. It's about forming a new family, isn't it? It's about leaving the old one, physically, emotionally. The marriage service puts it like this: forsaking all others, I'll cling to you and you alone. A word to parents here. If you have a son or a daughter who's married or getting married or planning to be married, you need to think about this. There's a huge shift that takes place when a son or a daughter gets married in your role in their life. You need to let them leave. Before we married, 38 years ago, my mother-in-law took Janet aside and said these words to her. She said, "Janet, if you ever come to me complaining about Sam, you need to know right now what I'm going to say to you. I'm going to say, Janet, you go straight back to him and you complain to him." And the reason she did that was because she'd seen in her family how a mother listening to the complaints of her daughter had actually contributed in a big way to the breakup of that marriage. Because eventually it became easier for the daughter to talk to her mum about her problems. And the more she talked to the mum, the less she talked to her husband. And it just ended in disaster. Thankfully, the Lord turned it around and they got back together again. But parents, please be aware of this. And please also be aware that if you've got a friend who's got married who starts complaining to you about their wife or husband, just please say, look, you need to go back to them, or you need to go and get some help. If you've got to the point where you can't talk anymore, go and get some help. Someone will help you to put things back together. Secondly, cleave. Stick to the person, no matter what. Richer, poorer, sickness, health, till death us do part. Those of us who are married have said those words. How strongly do we believe them and put them into action? One of the things I've tried to do is when I meet a new person, I deliberately put it in there that I'm married. I just mention Janet Now the reason I do that is actually to protect myself from the idea that I could possibly flirt with this person and to protect them from the idea that they could possibly flirt with me. I want to out myself right up front and put it beyond my own reach to do anything silly by saying, hey, I'm married. And I think that's a really wise thing to do. So that we keep telling ourselves, no, I am going to cleave to this person, no matter what. I'm going to cleave with them. I will not afford myself the luxury or the stupidity of imagining myself with somebody else. If that's beginning to happen in your head and you're married, do something about it. Do something about it. Just chuck that thought out. Pray, ask God to stop you thinking that way. So cleave. By the way, one of the reasons to out yourself is because part of the lure of illicit relationships is the secrecy that's involved in them. And if you bust your own secrecy right up front, then that's out of the way. Well, at least until next time it occurs to you. Thirdly, so leave, cleave, become one flesh. Now, this is not just physical, although of course it certainly includes that. But in this verse, leaving and cleaving are in the active voice. It's something that you do. But becoming one flesh is in the passive voice. It's something that happens to you. It indicates that when people marry, when they commit themselves in marriage to one another, there's something that God does, and he unites them as one, in one flesh. That's a wonderful thing. I remember after we got married and we were united physically, and it just felt so wonderful. I remember writing a letter to somebody and said 1 + 1 = 1. And I was a bit of a mathematician in those days. And but it's true, isn't it, that God gives us that unity together, which of course we have to protect and build and grow. But what God says here is true. Fourthly, we notice here in verse 25 that God's ideal for marriage is complete openness and shamelessness. Adam and Eve were naked and they did not feel ashamed. That was because there was nothing to be ashamed of. They were not ashamed of their sexuality. They were not ashamed of doing anything wrong. How our world longs for that kind of relationship, doesn't it? Where there's no condemnation, there's no guilt, there's just complete freedom and openness. That's the way God designed us. And actually, that's what he designed us for. We now can only find that in relationship with him because we're sinners and we do bear guilt. And wonderfully, through Jesus' work on the cross, that can be dealt with. But God made us for that relationship with himself. So what's the big deal about marriage? Why marriage? Well, the answer is, of course, that from the beginning that God made it because it wasn't good for man to be alone. That man and woman together might fulfill their God-given responsibilities that he made us for. He made it as the proper and the secure place for the expression of our human sexuality. He made it so that we would be fruitful and multiply, so that children can be brought up in security and in the safety of a stable and loving home. That's the way God set it up. And actually that's what our state view, the current one of marriage, reflects. Every person who gets married gets a brochure. In fact, when we fill out our papers, we have to tick that we've given them this brochure. It's called Happily Ever, Before and After. And there's a lot of advice in there for couples who are marrying. One of the bits of advice says this. The Family Law Act says, marriage is the union of a man and a woman to the exclusion of all others, voluntarily entered into for life. The family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society. So what's the big deal about marriage? Those things. It's the proper place for the expression of human sexuality. It's the place where that human loneliness, one of the places, not the only place, where that answer of the human loneliness can be met, that need. And it's the place where children can be born and be brought up in a safe and secure environment. So all these things from Genesis, that's the way we were meant to be. And that's the way it works best. I was reading a report about last 2016 in the UK. They're talking about breakdown of families, and they compared breakdown amongst families where the mum and dad were just cohabiting, where they weren't formally married, with married families. More than 50%, I think it's about 51%, of family breakdowns were families where the parents were just cohabiting. This in spite of the fact that married couples outnumber cohabiting couples by 4-1 in the UK. In other words, a child in a family where mum and dad were cohabiting, where they weren't married, was 2.5 times more likely to experience family breakdown than a kid who was in a family where the mum and dad were married. Now that in itself alone is good enough reason to push for marriage. Those of you who have been through family breakdowns know how terrible and awful it is. In spite of the fact that people say, oh, well, the kids will get over it. Well, no, they don't. That's the sad fact. So what's the big deal about marriage? That's what God wants. That's the way we work best. And that's what he designed for us to work best and to enjoy what he intended for us to enjoy. Now, we all know, of course, Genesis 3 follows Genesis 2. And in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve, the first couple, basically said to God, we don't want you at the centre of our world. We want to be there. We're going to decide what's right and wrong. Thanks for your advice, but no thanks. That's what happened. We call it the fall. I prefer to call it the jump. They knew what they were doing and they did it. And they pushed God out. And they suffered the consequences in their relationship and their family and everything. And what we've got in our culture now is where people are wanting to get back where we were before, where they have this sense of openness and shamelessness and guiltlessness and intimacy. And we're looking for it in all the wrong places. And trying to find that sense of intimacy and sexual fulfillment in any and every way. And of course, the further down that track we go, the worse things get. And this is why we as believers want to preserve that view of marriage that is in Genesis 1 and 2. Not just because we want to say that you need to do what the Bible says, but we want to say to people, friends, this is not good for you to live that way. It is not good for you. It will end badly. The wonderful thing, of course, living this side of the cross is all those failures and the sense of guilt and shame that we all feel. We have a place to take it, don't we? We can come to Jesus. We can come and experience and know his forgiveness. We can bring our brokenness to him, our shame, and know that the slate can be wiped clean. That's the point that Paul makes in Ephesians 5. Good marriage points to the good news. Good marriage points to the good news. Apologetics, by the way, is not about making an apology for marriage and trying to tell people how to live their married life. Apologetics actually is about giving an answer for the hope that is within us. That's what Peter says. And what is the answer to the hope that we have? It's a few verses later, actually, in 1 Peter 3, verse 18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God. That's the hope that we have. That Jesus died in our place. That the righteous died in the place of the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God. So Paul tells us in Ephesians 5, just very quickly, that God's greater purpose in marriage is to give us a reflection of the great fact of the good news, of the relationship of Jesus to his people. In the husband's sacrificial, unconditional love for his wife is, albeit imperfect, reflection of the perfect love of Jesus for his people, where he voluntarily went all the way to the cross and died as a common criminal. For what reason? So that we might be cleaned up, we might be presented without spot, without blemish, before God the Father. And the submissive, respectful, loving response of the wife reflects the response of the church to the work of Jesus, the one who did that for him, for us. And that our relationship with God and our relationships with each other should point to that reality of who Jesus is and what he has done for us. The church is often referred to as the bride of Christ. The bride of Christ. And of course, as we look to the future, the new creation, when ultimately we will all be united with Jesus, it's spoken of as a marriage feast. It's got nothing to do with sex. It's about the consummation of that relationship which will become perfect. We experience it imperfectly now. We struggle in our relationship with God. When we get to heaven, 1 Corinthians 13 tells us we will see him and we will know and we'll be known. Our relationships will be perfect. And that's why, of course, there won't be any need for marriage in heaven. Because all our relationships will be perfect. There will be no need to distinguish exclusive relationships. That's going to be wonderful, isn't it? And so that's why marriage is important as well, because it's a mystery that points us to the good news of Jesus Christ. So friends, that's something that we can put in front of the people who ask us those questions. They're probably not going to believe it. They're probably, I don't believe in your God, I don't believe in your Jesus. I don't take any notice of that. But when we answer their questions, we need to actually put in front of them the good news of Jesus so they can hear it and believe it and come to know him. Just as we finish, friends, I'm sure we've reflected on our own marriages or lack of them or whatever during this talk. Let me encourage each one of us to live the way God designed us, other-centered lives like Jesus. Love God, love others. Realise that when we live lives that are focused on ourselves and our needs, we're not doing what God designed us for. So we oughtn't to be surprised if we're miserable and our lives end up in a mess if we live like that. Living lives that are centred on God and centred on others are what we're designed for and what will work best. So that's the big deal about marriage. Doing it God's way is best for us and points to the wonderful reality of the relationship between Jesus and his people. I'm going to pray for us now. And then after that, we've got a few minutes for questions.